Thank you very much for that wonderful welcome. This is a bit of a model of how I work. I'm a scientist, a water scientist. I do research. That is the centre of that star. But I like to do science that addresses real problems. How do I do that? I do fact-based research, but it involves every element of that. And you'll see the top star is the community. What environmental problems should we be working on? Who owns the environment? For me, that answer always comes through the community, always. That's an integral part. There's no other priority with those other stars, but people doing research in my area have to get used to really dealing with every facet. We obviously work on the science in the centre. We interact with the media. From time to time, called in as expert witnesses for court cases. We have expertise and we're happy to share that. We'll work with industry, even if that can be dicey at times. We'll talk to politicians. I find if I do my work involved with the community and I'm in the media, they start to want to talk to me, and I have complete political colour blindness. If they're interested, I'll talk to them. If they're elected, and I've had fantastic conversations with legislators, but for me, that star spins, and it spins very quickly with PFAS. It changes every single time, week by week. Is it under control? I can probably answer that now, but I don't want to see a walkout. I'll ask you at the end. I have my own thoughts. PFAS is everywhere. And to be honest, I wasn't the slightest bit interested in this because I study the ecology of rivers. I like river life. Mayflies, fish, ducks, birds. I thought this was some hippie acronym. I didn't want to know anything about it. I don't particularly like it when people talk in acronyms. I think it's elitist and I can't connect. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. How do I pronounce that? PFAS. It's just a mouthful. It's in so many products. It's like a miracle industrial man-made chemical post-war, post-World War II. It actually started a bit before that, but it's in so many things. It's part of just about everyday life. Pizza boxes, takeaway food cups, shampoo, dental floss, firefighting foam. It's in so many different things. And it did a job really well. Heat resistant, moisture resistant, oil resistant, made a beautiful foam like a bubble bath that helped firefighters engulf burning fuel. There was nothing else like it. Did so many things really well. It is based on a chain of carbon atoms, and there is how many different types of PFAS chemicals? I've heard different estimates every time. It's thousands. But we know very well about 5 of them that don't break down and in fact do the opposite. And I'm sorry to say it, but they're in all of us. They're in all of you. As a matter of interest, has anyone here had their blood tested for it? Okay, that's rare. That's interesting.
Yeah.
It costs about $500 to get your blood tested, and you can't get it off Medicare or a health fund. This is an area of science, again, this spinning wheel, I've never seen anything like it. It's got lawyers, journalists, actors, scientists, legislators, and the general community, and cows. I'll explain that a bit later. Every now and then, if you're lucky, you can get this story from the New York Times, if you can get through the paywall. But this story, journalism really sparked a movement. The lawyer who became DuPont's worst nightmare. And I'm seeing the same in Australia. Journalism is really important. And I was lucky to get through. Have a good look at that. That's a lawyer. That lawyer was Rob Billot, an environmental lawyer who took on the company DuPont, who had been dumping waste on a farmer's land. That farmer Wilbur Tennant from West Virginia noticed that DuPont were dumping waste with his permission. That he was told it was basically office waste. He noticed a foam associated with that in the river, and then his cows started getting sick. Foam and cows. That's a theme. Remember that, please. Oh, and lawyers and farmers. So he spotted this unusual white foam. He contacted DuPont and said, "What is in your waste? Because it's making my cows sick." I did an update today. One by one, he lost 150 cows. And I've owned a few cows. Cows are pretty tough things. When he saw DuPont, they got veterinary surgeons who basically said, "It's your animal husbandry that's making them sick." And the lawyer took them on, thought this didn't add up, and that really started this movement. And then the Americans did a movie based on this case because it was a giant cover-up. Does anyone happen to think that there's a cover-up going on here with this in Australia? Okay. I didn't really have an opinion on that. Now I do. If there's a movie here, I'm wondering who will play me. This is the Australian equivalent journalist, Carrie Fellner. Carrie Fellner currently works for Fairfax and did some incredible work. She did that equivalent work in Newcastle, around the Williamtown Air Force Base. The Sorrow on Cabbage Tree Road. I checked it before I came here tonight. You can still get through the paywall. Newcastle Herald has been sold by Fairfax, but it's still available. And she did what they call shoe leather journalism. She went out there, door knocked, talked to people around the Air Force Base. It's still available, and it's one of the best long-form journalisms involving exploring PFAS, in my opinion, in Australia. So this is that line, and that line is an administrative line. Within that's considered the high impact zone, but if you're just outside of that, do you think you get support and compensation? She walked up and down Cabbage Tree Road outside of the impact zone and noted lots and lots of people in this area were getting sick before this was recognised. She wrote a series of articles 10 years ago. That was really important. That's really the first time it came to prominence, it came to the surface. And I do work with a lot of journalists. She has rung me a couple of times, and the first time I was terrified. I thought, what's she going to chase me for? What am I in trouble for? The foam and the fury. Now the foam, it's because PFAS, and it's a type of PFAS, I'm not going to give its full name, but it's an 8-chain carbon atom called PFAS. It was particularly good as a firefighting foam, and it was used at Newcastle Airport, which is also the Air Force Base, and for training purposes they use this foam again and again and again, and even at minute concentrations, and I'll talk about that in a second, this builds up and builds up. It does not take much at all, but it's a beautiful foam for firefighting. And if there's an aircraft crash and thousands of litres of burning fuel, I want them to use the best possible fire suppression, which they did here for training. But what disturbs me, New South Wales Health, when she explored this 10 years ago, refused blood tests, despite pleas from residents. And the Americans were very surprised by this because blood testing was a really important part for communities that have been exposed to PFAS. How else do you rate the level of exposure and link that to symptoms? In my view, that hasn't changed in 10 years here. One of the last things that Carrie Fellner has done, she's taken time off with career, she's on maternity leave, is she explored Wreck Bay, which isn't that far down the road at Jarvis Bay, which was also affected by repeated use of firefighting foam at the naval base, the Commonwealth Territory in Jarvis Bay, which affected the land, the creek, and the food of the local Indigenous people based at Wreck Bay. It's called How to Poison a Planet, And if you're feeling euphoric and you want to just come down a few notches, watch this. If you're feeling a bit down, perhaps not. Dark waters, likewise. Dark waters, it's a fictionalised version of a documentary, essentially. Warragamba Dam. I've talked about this to people of Sydney. They're very concerned about what they drink. You don't drink Warragamba Dam, but your water goes down there. Really important link. So the news hit in 2024 about what is in our water. And at the time, Sydney Water and most water utilities around Australia were not regularly testing or any testing of PFAS in drinking water. United States case studies show that's one of the main pathways to get into people. Food, exposure to chemicals through contaminated makeup and moisture-resistant clothing, but the big one is drinking water and contaminated food. This news came out because the United States changed their drinking water guidelines. The US EPA made a determination that there is no known safe level of PFAS in drinking water. And then the question became, why are the Australian guidelines so much tougher? Or are Americans a lot more susceptible to this? I think the big difference is the US EPA has sued the companies making this and have hundreds of millions of dollars which they're spending on monitoring and then taking action to clean up contamination. And the main contamination there that's been getting into people has been through the water supply. But this is how I got involved. This is when it wasn't just an abstract topic and a strange acronym. It turned up in platypus. So that's Catherine, Cat to me, with gloves on, catching a platypus. One of her most happy hunting grounds is actually just down the road at Berrima on the Wingecarribee River. There's a thriving population there. And it's not straightforward catching these. You need nets and permits. They're air breathers, so they can easily drown. Now, we don't kill any platypus for our research, but we get access to dead ones, which is sad, but we need to look in their liver. That's where the PFAS builds up. That's where it builds up in us, kidneys and liver in particular. We published the first paper on PFAS in platypus, and when we have to look at liver biopsy samples from dissected dead platypus, and when the results started coming in from the lab, the manager of the lab contacted us straight away. Where the hell is this from? That was the first information that the poor old platypus is like the canary in the coal mine for our water supply. And I've just got to talk about this. So Kat talked about this at that fantastic night at Bowral High School, but sadly, this is how we got a lot of our platypus, from people using yabby nets. And I've seen them here. I've pulled them out of the river. Yabby nets, platypus can't breathe like fish. They don't absorb oxygen from the water around them. They have to come to the surface, like dolphins, like whales, like us. And I have seen a picture of a net that contained more than a dozen dead platypus. People often will put and break open a can of something like tuna that will rot, that will bring the platypus, bring the yabbies, and the platypus are blind underwater, but they've got incredibly sensitive bills with electrosensors, and they'll pick up all this activity and come in to eat yabbies, and they won't be able to get out. So yeah, Cat did threaten violence to anyone who uses these nets. They are actually illegal in New South Wales. Sometimes they're called opera house nets because they collapse, but you can lift up the wire and it creates a similar kind of structure. Yes, I love your rivers. I'm very concerned about the state of your rivers. That is not a normal colour to me. I've sampled it with Cat, and that's just down at Burradoo. In fact, that's very close to the railway bridge. And as we've been sampling and doing our testing, I've said to people going past, is it normally this colour? And you think this is okay? It's not okay. But it is still a very happy ground for platypus downstream. So these are the locations where Kat got her platypus. They came from all over the state. A lot of them came either directly from the community or through Taronga Zoo. So they're the locations. You might see one strange one near the word Sydney on that. Like, how could a platypus live in the CBD? Any ideas? Yes. That was a platypus from the zoo. And that was the only one that didn't have PFAS. That was captive, died of old age. Think over 20 years. So I've highlighted platypus B. Kat didn't give names to the dead ones. We did not cut up live platypus. The third most contaminated platypus in the state was found here, from the Wingecarribee River at Berrima. That news for me had significance when Carrie Felmer in 2024 asked why there is no monitoring of water supplies. And the Chief Health Officer at the time said, Sydney's got clean catchments, there is no concern. I knew because of that platypus, it's here. I also knew, I worked at Sydney Water for nearly 20 years, they didn't monitor for it. How can you be certain something's not there if you don't test for it? Is that logical? Or perhaps you don't test if you don't want to find. So 11th of June was the date that the US EPA declared there's no known safe level. They've reduced all their guidelines. And that's where, Dr. Kerry Chan, she's a hero of mine, but I had to contradict her. I was interviewed for the ABC PM program. And because I knew the platypus was found here, it is Warragamba catchment, therefore there is PFAS in the catchment. I criticised her, but I did say she's been poorly advised. The PFAS chemicals are so dangerous, you need to get your head around how dilute they are and are still dangerous. I use new units. I use nanograms per litre. That's not a term I'd used before. I didn't know what a nanogram was. I thought it was a made-up kindergarten word. It is 1 part per trillion. And one drop, if you want 1 nanogram per litre, that's 1 drop in 20 Olympic swimming pools. Or 1 trillion seconds of time is 31,000 years. PFAS is dangerous at that sort of level, and it builds up in us from that level. It bioaccumulates to an incredible degree. And that's one of the, I call it a property, not a quality. That's one of the things about this. Even at such incredibly low concentrations, it's building up. And it is building up in us. We're playing PFAS guideline yo-yo at the moment. The American guidelines are up on the top left. They say that there's no known safe level for 2 of the common types, PFOA, PFOS. But they recognise that there's limits to detection. So they have created guidelines, and I've covered up some of them, unfortunately, but PFOA is 50 times higher. That's the acceptable level in Australian drinking water compared to Americans. Again, are Americans more susceptible, or are these guidelines actually calculated to protect us or some industry? There is some element of using science to protect the polluter, perhaps like we saw in the tobacco industry. I'm seeing elements of this. Our guidelines for drinking water temporarily changed and then they were doubled again. They're still much more lenient than the US guidelines. I'm very critical of government and the availability of information. And the best information on PFAS is actually provided by this website. And it's a voluntary project from Friends of the Earth. Now, I generate quite a bit of PFAS information through my research. They follow that and they follow all the researchers and they make that available. So at the time, there were 858 data points for New South Wales. You can hit that and explore right down to your local level. Interesting. There's no government website that enables you to get a broad view of information. In fact, good luck finding anything on this in your environment, in your food, in your water. And the same thing happens in America. It's a not-for-profit group that surveys all the different literature, all the water utilities, government websites, and makes that available. The Environmental Working Group. It's a similar not-for-profit that tries to share available information, to break down the silos and make whatever information available. The most contaminated large water source in Australia was Blue Mountains. Sydney Water had been monitoring PFAS levels in their sewage and sewage solids for about 8 years when they decided to actually start measuring it in the drinking water. I'm actually not joking about that. They monitored for the first time and made it publicly available, and the most contaminated supply was up at Blackheath and Katoomba, Upper Blue Mountains. It rates as a high level of contamination compared to worldwide water supplies. Do you notice that the units of measurement are a bit different? They use micrograms per litre. Surprised they don't use milligrams per litre, because then it would be 0.0000164. Looks like a very small number. I automatically look at that and just convert that to nanograms. They're really big numbers. Cascade, Katoomba, PFAS, that's actually 16.4. The current Australian guideline is 8. The US guideline's 4. There's no known safe level. So that was June 2004. I'd got myself into a bit of trouble at this point. That spinning disc serrated me a bit. I think I've got the picture coming up, but the information that came out straight away, look at the word negligible. So Water New South Wales run Warragamba Dam, all the big dams around the country, and including the Upper Blue Mountains water supply. They're not a health authority, but they provided the community with the advice that the PFAS levels in their supply are negligible. I don't live there, but I was really offended by that. I quickly looked at the online negligible definition. So small or unimportant as to not be worth considering. Insignificant. I've now met hundreds of people that have been drinking that, many of whom that have health issues, that are highly offended by that sort of statement. And there is this continual pushback from the government. Not a problem. Look over there. We've cleaned it up now. And the good thing is, and to Sydney Water's credit, when that was discovered, Sydney Water are the retailer that get the water from Water New South Wales. Within a couple of months, they were treating it to remove it. Science is really good for action. Pity that didn't start monitoring for so many years. This is the day I got into a lot of trouble. Sydney Morning Herald contacted me. Ben Cubby and Carrie Fellner. Ben Cubby came with me. That's Walter Peters, a bit of a hero photojournalist of mine, and we're standing in Greaves Creek in between two of the reservoirs. He's actually taking a photo of foam. Remember me talking about foam? I'm going to talk about foam again. But that's the protected catchment, and there's a publicly accessible track. I went out with the Herald and took a few samples. Now, PFAS is expensive to test, somewhere between $150 and $300 a sample. The Sydney Morning Herald told me they'd pay for the testing. They haven't yet, but that's okay. I felt like I had, in terms of tests, I had 4 bullets in the chamber, in the revolver. So I took a sample there, I went to a couple of other sites, and we hit a bullseye. I've never done anything like this before. We hit the most contaminated source that helped track down where that contamination in the Blue Mountains is coming from. Walter Peters also used some amazing tricks of light to get a reasonably acceptable photo of me. One of my friends from the media said, "Ian, it nearly made you good looking." I got in so much trouble because I am from the water industry and I wasn't happy with the information they were providing. Why not work with the journalists? Why not work with the media and uncover it, the source? There's another photo of me bending over and showing my backside to the camera. We went out and we hit Fairlock Road drainage. We're publishing a paper with Carmel and a couple of other co-authors. It's going to come out next week on this. It's from a truck crash that happened in 1992. and the contamination is so high. Look at the PFAS level. This is nanograms, 2,300. No known safe level, but the US EPA recommend less than 4. For us, it's 8. I got in so much trouble. How do I know I got in trouble? Because the journalists were telling me that the water industry was backgrounding against me. Oh, he did rough and dodgy science. He wasn't using the right bottles. He didn't do this correctly. I embarrassed them. And I embarrassed them because they hadn't been putting this information out in the community. I actually thought it was going to come from another location, and I got a whole line of zeros. But again, Sydney Water, very wealthy company. They sell a lot of water, over $3 billion worth, sewerage and water. A lot comes from the Southern Highlands. They do very well out of you. They could institute very quickly, bring in essentially modules of filters, all types of resin filters and different pore sizes, incredible. It wasn't reverse osmosis, but it was effectively. Shows the importance of monitoring. Pity they didn't have good policy 20 years earlier, but they have dropped the level of PFAS back to acceptable and much lower levels. Science, monitoring and policy is really important in this area, but it's in all of us. The strangest source of the data, because I was getting reports from the community. I've had my blood tested, cost about $500. I don't know what a normal level is. Thanks to Australian Bureau of Statistics, we know, because they've done a health study and done blood samples from a whole range of people. The news is confronting. It's building up in all of us. It builds up with age. Slightly higher in males. Monthly loss of menstrual blood actually reduces PFAS concentrations in females. But it builds up in age, and the level of biomagnification from drinking water or food is huge. We're all walking bioaccumulators of this. The good news is well below the level of a lot of other countries, certainly well below America. John Dee. He's essentially the centre of the Blue Mountains community that's concerned about this. He's brought up a family, and he now knows that since that truck crash in 1992, we don't have the data, so there's huge gaps of information, but he's probably been exposing his family to PFAS. And we know from the literature the effects of PFAS are much greater on the developing human body, the developing brain, the developing all biological systems in the body. So he is leading basically the community concern about PFAS for the Blue Mountains. The community there is very concerned, and one of the famous cinematographers that live in the area has come out, quite a few people came out to explain that they have had a lot of medical symptoms. PFAS, because it builds up in the liver and kidneys, is associated with disease of both, as well as a whole list of others. The community is concerned. He actually explained that it helped him to know that his PFAS was high because there are measures you can take to reduce PFAS levels in the community. But the community, I've actually never dealt with that sort of emotion before. And part of it is anger about the information and the denial of blood testing for them. At $500 a test for a lot of people in the community, that's beyond their means. This was footage of the truck crash, 1992. It was a petrol tanker, 40,000 litres, and it overturned and caught fire. John Dee's met a lot of people that were at the scene. Think about the first responders that used the foam and got covered with it. But it ran down. It's a very small catchment. It's just over the road from the Hydro Majestic, and it runs down about 1 kilometre before it enters one of the reservoirs there. I can't go into that area because it's a restricted area, but I went to places that I could sample, and the contamination is tens of thousands of times higher still today. I did my last samples there in October and November last year, resulting from that one single incident, as far as we can tell. And in a parliamentary hearing, New South Wales Fire Brigade confirmed that was the location. foam and cows. I'm also involved with helping the community in the Cadia, Orange, Blaney, and the Ballabula River. That is the Ballabula River. See that foam? This suddenly appeared. Now, this community, to be frank, is very concerned about impacts from a nearby gold and copper mine. But the town of Blaney, Canowindra is downstream, and there's other potential sources. Don't do this. Don't do this. If you see a foam like that in the river, wear personal protective equipment, glove up. But there's a remarkable person, Frances Watalak, who lives in the community, who saw this foam and she grabbed an esky. Don't do that and then put a picnic lunch in it. And then tested that foam. I never would have done this in a million years. So I'm glad I work with her. That's why I work with the community. And that's why it's good to work with citizen scientists, because it was full of PFAS. Absolutely loaded with PFAS. Which isn't surprising, it is a foaming agent. So once I saw the results, I went back. You notice I covered myself, the skin, gloves. We went and carefully sampled lots and lots of samples of the foam. We had it tested. It is basically gluing PFAS chemicals and metals from the whole river into this foam on the surface. And then we've been fighting with the EPA about recognising this as a major pollution source. That's what it looks like in some places. Small hand-sized globs of foam hit something like this tree, and essentially it's a skimmer, and it builds up and builds up. And that stuff is evil. We published a science paper on this. The degree of concentration, I think I've got a statistic coming here. The concentration of PFAS in the river is 20 to 30 nanograms in the river, 20 to 30. In the foam, the average level was 375,000 nanograms per litre. It worked in a really strange way. The PFAS was also grabbing, it was like a glue, it was also grabbing metals from the river, and it was concentrating that in this evil foam. This is what you'd want to feed your enemy if you could. I don't know that it'd be a horrible way to go, but it was doing the same thing. Copper in the river was 3 micrograms in the water. It was 2,900 micrograms in the foam. We're still exploring this. We wrote a paper on this. It's the first we could find. So the PFAS is at very low concentrations in the environment, but we think it's the bubbling of the river. The Ballabula, not here, but further upstream. It's a very steep river, so there's lots of small waterfalls and fast-flowing sections, and the bubbles. It's actually a technique they use in a lot of industry. They call it foam fractionation, and the PFAS is attracted to those bubbles and jumps onto them. That's why it foams. It's a strange chemical. I'm not a chemist, but talk to a chemist. They'll talk about it's got really unusual behaviour. How do you reckon that goes for their farm? The river is a really important water source for their farm. There's an aerial view of the land. The news is not all good. If cattle drink water, they're even more sensitive than us. If they drink water with 3 nanograms across their life, they will fail the meat guidelines for the European Union, the European Commission. So as long as we eat our meat locally, it doesn't matter about Australians, but we can't export it into some markets if they drink. That river is generally 9 to 10 times higher than that 3 nanograms. What do you think would happen to the cattle in that foam? You could get a lifetime of PFAS exposure. A cow on a hot day can easily drink 100 litres. Do you think this is in control? We don't even know what the impacts are. We don't know how to get rid of it. It is generally not monitored in the environment. And I feel like I'm in the middle of a detective novel and I don't know what's about to happen. I noticed something change when, in the community, when they found out their fish aren't safe to eat in that Ballabula River. Something happened. I saw the community down at Canowindra, and I went to a meeting like this, and this is a lovely meeting, but the setting at Canowindra was fantastic because it was at a winery, and I got handed a beautiful glass of wine as I walked in, and you offered me one, which is lovely. But the locals had just had a fishing competition for kids. Did you know that it's a big thing for teenage kids to go fishing? It's really big. I see them with fishing rods everywhere. We had been telling the EPA, that's what I do. We tell the regulators. I don't keep the science a secret. We were telling the community, we were holding town hall meetings, we were telling the EPA, this is a major problem. You need to do a survey of the whole river. And we only found out that the EPA commissioned fisheries to test fish because Frances Vitalik has a big property and she escorted the fisheries officers onto her farm where they got a lot of Murray cod, one of a critically endangered fish. It's one of the few rivers where there's lots of Murray cod. And because she knew of, that was January last year, the EPA released the results. When do you think? They released them in August because she then harassed them to release it, and she had to do a freedom of information. It's called a GIPA request. Some of you have probably done that and found out, and I've just done a bit of it's a blurred image on the right. The most contaminated Murray cod, if you ate one fork of it, 10 grams, that was your daily limit for PFAS. So they've basically warned that you don't eat fish from the river. Something changed with the community when that happened. When you tell the people in the community, yeah, the river's fine, but don't eat the fish from it. There was a lot of doubt about the case in the Blue Mountains that it was one truck crash and fire and the suppression of the fire with fire foam. And in fact, I dealt with a lot of journalists, and one of the top journalists I dealt with said, I just don't believe it. I'm sorry, I don't believe it. I don't believe contamination from 32 years ago, a single incident can cause it. So guess what? We found a second. How did we find it? Contaminated platypus. The second most contaminated platypus was downstream of here. This is Ourimbah, Central Coast, Ourimbah Creek. Do you want to know where the most contaminated one was found? Hunter River. The second most was here. Guess what? It's a water catchment. It's part of the Gosford Wyong water supply, now called Central Coast Water. And that wetland, that's a photo my wife unkindly took of me in the water. I'm a little bit of a Labrador. If I see water, I want to jump in it. I've got an appetite to match too. That's Ourimbah Creek. Ourimbah Creek is not a huge part, but it tops up. The Central Coast Water is the third biggest water utility in New South Wales. Sydney Water's the biggest, then Hunter Water at Newcastle, and this is number 3. Population here is growing quickly. They suffer severe water shortages. So Ourimbah has a weir where they grab water, but they also have a bore field, so a series of groundwater pumps. They're big. They're the size of a Pantech truck, a whole series of them. I haven't tested the groundwater, but there's serious PFAS contamination in the creek. We have tracked it down and found that on the 8th of December in the year 2000, there was a tragic petrol tanker crash on the M1. When basically halfway between Sydney and Newcastle, you come down a steep hill. A lot of you will know this because there's a speed camera on the hill, and then it flattens out. A car and a truck collided. It was a tragic one because 2 people were killed and burnt, and they kept better records than the 1992 crash at Medlow Bath, but they used a lot of PFAS chemicals as they did. DuPont and 3M already knew that this stuff was dangerous and was building up in people and wildlife, but it hadn't got through the different channels. And in fact, I think they were still making it, but they had announced in the year 2000 they were going to get out of the business. But we went looking in Ourimbah Creek, and eventually looked in both the water, but we also look at the sediment. PFAS is attracted to sediment, but we know it's here. We did very glamorous work just over the road here, Iron Mines Creek. We actually sampled treated sewage effluent from Mittagong sewage treatment plant. The glamour of my life. I've sampled a lot of sewage around here. Concentrations were thankfully very low. But we also sampled the sediment in creeks because that's where it builds up, a bit like our liver. It can bind to charged particles. And the highest contamination we found in the Warragamba catchment, we went to Goulburn and to Lithgow as well, was at Berrima in the Wingecarribee River just above the bridge, which is the platypus spot. Thanks everyone. Thank you. Thank you.